some of the standards at both a national and international level with the BSI and ISO. We share a lot of our knowledge and experience through industry events such as this one, normally in person, but increasingly over the last couple of years online, and supporting a lot of different industry groups and initiatives all around the world. And I think probably for over a decade, I've either chaired or been a member of committees or groups of people really who are just really trying to drag the construction industry into the 21st century. But in all of that, I think what I've learned is, in terms of information management, there's nothing really that new. I think the only new bit is that we need to work together to be able to manage information effectively. And in fact, OPRAM, if you're wondering, is actually Latin for working together. And so it's through OPRAM really that I get to work with a lot of like-minded individuals, teams, organisations, and governments on either a voluntary or a free basis. And in doing so, I personally never stop learning as well. This is not something about, yes, I've now learned ISO. There's still a constant stream of learning to be had, and that's where they're providing advice and guidance to global organisations and projects, developing the self-led learning courses that we have available on OPRAM Academy, and these are mainly geared towards existing industry professionals, but we also provide that content free of charge to schools and colleges to try and educate the next generation of professionals, and delivering instructor-led training as well to teams, both on the technical aspects of ISO 19650, but also on increasingly a lot more on the sort of softer, what people would say are softer skills in terms of being able to, or what I feel that information managers need to be able to drive transformation throughout their organization. And that's probably these last 2 points, I think, that I'll probably just highlight briefly. So which brings me on to my my one slide, which so hopefully this is gonna work as well. So if I share that, and then I do that just to bring it up. Okay, so hopefully you're probably familiar with the Rogers adoption curve, as it's known, in sort of different guises, and basically it outlines the different groups of people who adopt things at different stages. Okay, and I would say myself, Clive, and the rest of the panel presenters, would probably fall into that innovators group. So roughly 2.5% of the industry, which is great, but it's nowhere near enough to make this as business as usual. And I think we're in this stage now where we've got all of these sort of superheroes in organisations and projects who are doing their very best, working tirelessly to do what they can with the resources that they have. Okay, but a lot of them are trying to struggle to get any traction, and this is not sustainable. It's not sustainable for the individual, but it's not sustainable for the construction industry. The reality is these people are just going to get fed up and they're going to move on to other industries, okay, and we're going to lose them. And so I think this is not scientific by any means. This is just purely based on our personal experience with OPRAM Academy. I would estimate that we probably just broke through into this next group in terms of the early adopters. Okay, and this is the reason for that is because initially when we started, it was a lot of the BIM managers and the digital construction managers and the sort of information managers who wanted to get trained up. But increasingly we're starting to see, and I'm talking probably the last 12 months, increasingly asset managers, commercial managers, design managers, construction managers, project managers particularly, coming along to get themselves trained up in terms of the ISO 19650 series. And this is great, okay, but it's still not enough to get ISO 19650 business as usual. And to put that into context, apologies, I've only got numbers for the UK, but there's 3.1 million people in the UK construction industry. And so if you sort of divvy that out across that adoption curve, then I would say that we're probably still just under 3 million people left to train, okay, or at least 1.5 million people just to reach that tipping point. Okay, and only at that point would you start to see, I believe, that the ISO 19650 or the information management process within ISO 19650 starts to become business as usual. So in short, we've got the process, the technology is pretty much there, and so for me, now is the time to start focusing in on the people. Okay, and that's why I believe that training on ISO 19650 is so critical. Okay, that's me off my soapbox.
So that's an interesting stat, and seeing how we've only just scratched the surface, and you're seeing more and more. There were a few questions already saying, who needs to be trained. We can come more to that when we go through. Yeah. But it's interesting to hear you say that there are now more and more people being trained from an operations perspective as well. So it's not just about,
no, a lot of, obviously we get to see the individuals, but organizations as well. We're starting to see a lot more clients come on board as well, taking up subscriptions. So yeah, I think we're starting to move out of that innovators into those early adopters, but it is only, the people who want to learn new and better ways of managing information. Okay, we need to tap into that early majority, to make sure that they're probably the ones sort of thinking, oh, I'll wait until I have to. That's the group that we need to really target.
Yep. I'm sure this will come up because I can see other questions that we need to transfer, but they're all related to exactly that. Like, as in, how do you tip over? How do you go from that early majority to? Cool. Okay, I'm excited. I've got a load of questions as well. So okay, but let's. Rob, are you ready to rock and roll and share a bit about a case study? Let me see. Can you? Fantastic. So yeah, Rob doesn't need an introduction, but I love everything that you've done in the industry and stuff that you share. Some stuff, inspires some of the ways that we put things as templates and stuff in the software that we have. We can't thank you enough, and I'm sure the industry does, but you're here to share some practical stuff. That's what I love about what you do as well, is you like to get shit done. It's not just talking about it. So yeah, over to you. I'll shut up.
So I'll share my screen. Hopefully you can see my screen. Clive gave me 6 to 8 minutes to talk a case study, but obviously, that's an awful short time to cover the implementation of ISO 19650. But for those of you who don't know Bon Brian, very briefly, we are first and foremost an architectural practice, but we also have both a digital and a strategic, and soon a landscape brand as well. But the digital brand has now been around for 5 years, pretty much since April 2016, when the UK government mandate came in, and information management is pretty much our primary service, with a few other bits around that. I kind of dropped this in really just to give some context. In the UK, obviously we've been on a journey for quite some time, and Paul used some numbers there and who's adopting it. The UK has recently updated the BIM mandate, now known as the Information Management Mandate, and just picking out, there's lots of references to the ISO 19650 series. So this covers government mandated jobs, centrally procured jobs, but you see this then going down to local government and private clients as well. So the drive there, it's certainly in the last, not just the last few months, but before that. So I think it's important to note that, both ISO 19650 parts 1 and 2, there are other parts as well, have been around for now almost 3 years. It was December 3 years ago that they were published. So this isn't something that is new, although some people are only just discovering it. And as Paul mentioned, there's probably a lot more people who need to follow this. But we've been applying this to all of our projects pretty much since January 2019, without exception, really. I think just to sort of make a note, for those in the UK, it's very similar to what went before it, the PAS, the Public Available Specification, and the British Standard Series, but it's not the same. And I'm kind of a bit fed up of seeing people doing find and replace and then saying, oh, it's the same thing and we can convert the terminology. That isn't quite the case. And there's some terminology that we have to understand in there that's been deliberately made generic for the international market as much as anything. And I know there was lots of discussion. I'm sure Paul could fill us in on all the arguments about what this how this arrived at, but people kind of get a bit het up about this. But once you understand what it means, it's not that difficult. And I should say that ISO 19650 in the UK is only part of the standards that we need to follow. Some of them I've listed below, and those are still part of the equation, and we still have some historical standards that have yet to be replaced by ISO. What I will say is that we have massive challenges in the UK to delivering this. We still have references, and we still see this abroad as well, with references to BIM level 2. BIM level 2 in the UK has not existed, or has been removed effectively since October 2019, and is now referred to as the UK BIM framework. So the UK BIM framework is the overarching standard that ISO 19650 fits into. We still see lots of references to things like LOD. LOD really is, we're trying to get rid of that, trying to get rid of numbers, we're trying to talk in plain language, a lot of this stuff. My biggest pet hate is exchange information requirements that actually don't have any information requirements in them. We often see it, oh, well, it's all in the asset information requirements, but under the ISO, it really is meant to be exchanged under the exchange information requirements, and not be about standards and coordinates and what version of Revit you want to use. It's really about what information do you want to exchange. And there are other things on this list that are challenging us. Technology, still a lack of frameworks, and employing information management are part of that. And there's still a lot of rubbish going on, and still poor support. But setting aside of the challenges, there are lots of positives. The UK BIM framework in the UK has been a massive sort of step forward. It supports ISO 19650. If you've not come across it, it's still relevant across the globe. And obviously developing guidance, and we've been involved in developing some of that guidance, and continue to be. We are seeing clients really wanting to drive around ISO 19650. So I, earlier in the year, worked with the Department for Education. I'm now working with the Ministry of Justice. So big government departments looking to implement this. And there is a realization that exchange information requirements from those more mature clients should be about the information, the whole information, not just models, not just data, but documentation as well. And I think it's often forgotten that documentation is probably, for most, is actually where you start. And most organizations do have information requirements. They're simply not in the BIM documents, they are somewhere else. And the other thing is that we are now starting to move away from the need for documents as they're known, and ISO really refers to these as resources. So slowly killing the use of Word and Excel, and I'll touch on that in a second. Again, we're starting to see the odd framework, and starting to see the improvement in technology with that process. And there are things coming up that are going to continue to improve this process. The diagram on the right hand side is on our blog. It's an attempt to sort of put ISO 19650 Part 2, but there's also ones for Part 5 and Part 3 as well, available on our blog in PDF and searchable or interactive versions. They're just designed really to try and document that standard in one place, just for simplicity really. But we're still seeing more guidance coming out. We're starting to see those government EIRs that will get pushed down to others, and we're starting to see alignment. My colleague Emma is also involved in the Government and Industry Interoperability Group, bit of a mouthful of a gig for sure, which is looking at open BIM, and both in the short term and the long term. And we've got the information management framework. So there's a lot of good stuff and a lot of positives behind those challenges that are going on. So just briefly, in terms of a case study, how we're implementing it, we've built our own technology solution, and we've built our own technology solution using existing technology platforms. We're not programmers, we are information managers, and other platforms do exist, one of them being Planoly, of course, but there are many platforms that you could do this on. But really what we tried to do is build an approach around ISO 19650 and the 8 stages that go through with that process. This is one, just to give you an example of one we're doing at the moment with Southern Housing Group for a project. So this is a residential project. You can see here the whole setup of the process is all around ISO 19650, and we don't have any documents anymore. They are resources, they are a web page, for want of a simpler way of looking at it. But we're also behind that using databases, and we're using another technology solution to document our requirements, the exchange information requirements. So on the left, you see the data side of things and documenting that. And that same data on the right-hand side in the same piece of software is being displayed as an output, effectively as a page. This kind of shows you the need for documentation, geometrical information, and alphanumerical in a single place, in this case for an electric actuator. And we're looking at ways to make this more easy to understand for users, and obviously, other solutions like Planoly are doing similar things. And I think we're probably all learning off each other in that process. And as I said, documentation is important as well, not just models. So it is about documenting, whether you want drawings, whether you want reports, what format you want them, when do you want them, who's providing them, are they structured, unstructured, and so on. And again, built around purposes. So this is a small example of the one we've built for the DFE, which we put into a database afterwards. And this is just, literally fresh off the thing. A new functionality came out in the technology we had yesterday, and my colleague has been looking at how we could use that to capture field data in a more kind of user-friendly fashion for people providing some information about doors. So we're using technology. Technology is not our driver, and we could change platform tomorrow. We're very much driven by the information and collecting that information in order to provide it to clients against their purposes, and that's our goal in this. Equally behind that, we also have what we've called a shared resources hub that supports our information hub, and that's more around the training side of things. So this is more specific training, very much about how do you deliver a compliant IFC, for example, out of Revit, how do you produce a compliant COBie, and sometimes it's pointing at other resources as well, and that's something we kind of developed more recently. I'll just finish really with saying, if you want more information both about ISO 19650 and what's going on in the UK, the UK BIM Framework website is an excellent place to start, even if you haven't got access to the standards themselves. They are to be read alongside the standards, but there's both a PDF version and a digital version, and we're involved in helping set up the digital version, so it's searchable if you don't know where to go and look, and it's a good starting point to improve your knowledge. And that's it from me.
Very cool, very cool. It's so cool to see everything you create in the tools. And somebody just asked, what was that? So in Airtable, it looks really cool, like as in it's kind of appealing. And I think that's a big challenge. Sometimes there's so much data. So it's like, how do you get people to want to see it? How do you get people to engage?
So we're actually using 3 technology solutions. We're actually using Notion as the front end, which is the Word bit. We're using Airtable as the database, and we're using Whimsical Powers as a process diagram bit. And it's very much about open BIM, use the right tools for the right job. We've used a combination of tools to do that. We're also using Mortar on another project, and who knows, we may use Planoly as well, in the future. But we're not driven by the technology, we're driven by the information, and that's the important bit. It's about, it doesn't matter, you could do it in Word, you could do it in Excel if you want to do it smartly, but databases, to me, the core message is databases, online technology is the best way, because ultimately you can compare your EIR against what you're delivering, and that is so critical to the process.
Yep, very cool. Thank you so much for sharing, Rob. I'll jump back in here, and hopefully you can see my screen. We will now move on to Noha has joined us, and I'm going to hit play unless you would like to jump in.
Oh, please go ahead. Thank you. I'm very pleased to be with you today. My name is Noha Salib, and I'm an associate professor at Middlesex University. I'm also program leader for our master's degree in BIM Management and Integrated Digital Delivery. But I also have another hat besides my academic one as an architect and consultant in industry. And it's because of those 2 hats that I was able actually to define this sweet spot between what needs to be delivered in education and in alignment with industry, which is my understanding as well of how many institutions have that on hand. So the idea is that education shouldn't just deliver best practices that are out there or advocate certain processes or practices, but it's also about delivering the challenges and how to manage them. And hence, when we start talking about how you can be ISO 19650 ready, the first thing that actually we need to produce for our students who are employees in the industry is how to do a gap analysis. How do you identify those missing areas, the areas that need improvement, that need enhancement in your workplace? And gap analysis involves many things related to resourcing, of course, but they also need to identify those lacking processes. And it's one thing to talk about the old silo techniques of the different disciplines working alone, but the problem is identifying this thing on the right here, where you think that you are actually delivering integrated digital delivery, where everybody's working together, but they're actually not. They're still working with the old traditional methods, even though they think that they are working together in tandem and in collaboration. And they end up actually adding an extra layer of complexity with all of the software. But do they really identify? Do they really see it? And it's our job in education to have them see these defective workflows on their own projects within their teams. So that's one thing that needs to be identified. The other thing that needs to be identified is where do we actually get the drop in the information management within the different stages? That is something as well that needs to be identified with our help, hopefully, in education, so that it can be identified in industry. And furthermore, how that affects collaboration. Because we use the words collaboration, cooperation, coordination, all synonymously, but they actually have different meanings, different connotations, and different workflows that need to be identified. These are things that's our responsibility to actually introduce to those employees in industry when they approach us or come to us. Of course, in the end, after identifying challenges and the gap analysis, this needs to be related directly to all of the different ingredients, we call them, that converge together in order to formulate that integrated digital delivery processes and procedures, and identifying which ones are feasible actually to put on a strategy in the workplace and which one are currently not feasible. Not everything can be done at the same time. There has to be a transition into them. We have to identify which ones are suitable, which ones are maybe to be integrated in future. After the gap analysis, it's important to identify the information management categories. And these are many. So people usually concentrate on the processes side of it, on the procedures and the data, especially the graphical information. But there are other areas like people, their trainings, their morale, the organizational strategy, the organizational business objectives, the infrastructure underlying all of this. And it's our job in education to highlight how these integrate together. It's also important to highlight all of the different risk categories involved in all of these information categories and how to create mitigation plans for them as part of the life cycle, as part of the overall strategy. Of course, we are aware that there are so many different categories, technical, operational, not just strategic, that need to be talked about. But then this comes later after identifying all of the previous issues that I mentioned. The next stage is the documentation management. So of course, information is within the documentation. And as per the ISO 19650, there is a lot of focus on which documents to produce, which appointing and appointed parties should produce what, in what order, in what context. Again, this is something that needs to be identified, the legalities of it. Are there any other orders is there any other order that these documents can be produced? Single, multiple EIR, single, multiple BEPS, when do they get introduced and why and how? All of this is something that needs to be focused on in education with real life projects. The next stage is how to write your business objectives. Now, this is an area that I have been very actively involved in for more than 5 years, identifying all of the different business goals that should be incorporated and define the information goals, the AIR as well goals that need to be identified and how they affect the projects. So it's not just about writing an EIR and a BEP, but how do you define your business objectives right from the beginning? How do you then define the areas and compare between them if you are writing an EIR, for example? It is not a straightforward exercise. There are many factors that affect it. How do you put forward your standards and how they affect as well your documentation in many different ways? The difference between the different tables. I mean, we could see as an example, the responsibility matrix and the MIDP have similar information inside them, but why have them both? There is a different focus. So this needs to be identified when to use them. And the last category that we need to talk about is the operational side. So how to produce quality assurance and quality control in whatever is being produced, whether technical, operational, or strategic policies, workflows, and procedures. So things like, how do you do validation and verification in your work? What's the difference between them? These are, for example, constantly used synonymously, but they're not. There are different ways of identifying them and producing them. How this is related to certifications that everybody's just going and just taking, but what is the actual quality that is coming out of it? How do you, for example, cleanse, standardize, and enhance your data? What would be considered as failed BIM workflows? It's always about trying to mitigate for the negative rather than just advocate the positive. How would the involvement of other disciplines right at the start of the project prevent this failed BIM workflows or integrated digital delivery workflows, and why? How does procurement affect these workflows, for example? And finally, last but not least, how do you put about an effective change management strategy to put these new workflows into effect? It is one thing to actually know what to do, but how do you actually implement it in the workplace? That's a completely different issue. How do you deal with the different stages of team formations? Again, a completely different issues. So I hope that was a little bit of a highlight on the main strategies that we use in education to complement industry workflows and processes. And I'm happy to take any questions at any time. Thank you very much.
That was excellent to hear. I really love the fact that it's not just about teaching people this is the list of checkboxes to check and create. It's actually relative to, and because you have people in industry there, which is fantastic. Let me ask everyone to throw their cameras back on, and we will go to a quick Q&A. I say quick, there are
we've seen the questions.
there are loads of questions. Yeah, I was just about to put another one in, but I don't know who it is, so I'm just going to put not sure. I don't know whether to start there or to start, if you guys have got questions that you found that maybe you wanted to answer, but that last one was, is ISO 19650 being adopted outside of the UK?
Yes.
There we go.
Yeah, no, I mean, although we're based in the UK, I think there's probably 3/4 of our customers are outside the UK, both on the advisory and the educational. So for me, that's a clear indicator really in terms of the interest. For us personally, where that is, I would say Australia is definitely somewhere that it's they're starting to sort of gain a lot of traction in the different states. Middle East, as well as another area where it's in pockets. A lot of the clients, particularly, are starting to pick that up. And yeah, other parts of Europe are probably the main places that certainly we're starting to see at least people that want to learn more about it. Let's put it that way.
And Noha, your students are coming from all around the world as well?
Yes, based on what I currently see, I mean, our students who are, I mean, they're all employees in industry. They're from about 23 countries around the world. And I see a lot of adoption in Asia, Hong Kong, these areas, and in the Middle East, like what Paul is saying. Towards the West, not as much. So we see like Europe, Asia, Middle East, but not maybe towards the American continents. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that there was some more questions about Canada adoption as well. We did a launch for Canada and ISO 9650, I think about 2 months ago. So I think that there's a lot of movement there. I see some people from that space online. I realized that I didn't share the poll results. Let me share the poll results. I was looking at them thinking, wow, they're pretty good. nobody else saw them. So it shows quite a good spread. I mean, to help us to understand where people are in their BIM journey, there are people on the call that have just started and those that right the way through to using BIM on every single project. And then from an ISO 19650 perspective, it looks like most of the people are just starting to look into ISO 19650. So you guys are in the right place. And if there are some other questions that you've seen, Rob, Paul, Nohar, if there are some things that you can just answer, that would be great. Otherwise, we'll start firing some questions at you. The ones that I love, they're very poignant, all about LOD. So there are, I saw, so there was one from Matthew.
You should rename your platform, Clive.
So it's a fun topic, because I don't know how many people know the story, but we failed on that, first of all, because we named the platform after the problem we were trying to solve. And somebody said to me, it was like naming a dentist surgery root canal surgery. Nobody wants to go to it. But yeah, so thankfully, plan early is a much better way of describing what we do and what we care about. But LOD. So Matthew says, what will be the alternative to LOD? And Marcin says, it is a longer question, but it is great that level of information need has replaced LOD and various other numerical metrics, but the concept itself is not easy to grasp from ISO 19650. Are there any real examples of proper specifications of level of information need? ? So I know that obviously the standard is still in review, and obviously the 17412, the number is now just swapped over. So it's all developing as a framework. But any comments there? Rob, do you want to start?
Yeah, so I think fundamentally what we've got to realize is that users don't understand numbers. So LOD 100 or 200 or other conventions that have been introduced, the issue is that doesn't mean a lot to a layperson. And I think it's important to understand why we're trying to get rid of it first before kind of discussing how to solve it. So for me, it makes a lot of sense. Users don't understand it. I would say that 99% of projects, nobody ever cares about it, because it's just, you've put these numbers, but nobody actually knows how to check it or automate it or what it means. And I think we've obviously been trying to implement that on projects, and it's really about defining about whether, firstly, is information, does it even need to be modeled? Is it modeled? Is it 2D? Is it 3D? Is it a document? Then it's about, what kind of three-dimensional, how detailed does that three-dimensional object need to be? Does it need to be parametric or not? And it's really keeping it at that simple level. I mean, for me, I always thought LOD, even in textual terms, is sort of overblown. At the end of the day, it's about information meeting what it's always done, which is meeting the drawing output that we've always wanted. And I think we've made it too complicated as an industry, and we've over-focused on it. And for me, it's not the biggest driver. It's actually going back, firstly, if you're starting your journey, it's about what documents you want before you even get into how detailed you want a model. And in reality, most models are probably over-detailed rather than under-detailed. And most clients couldn't handle most of those detailed models. And we're actually seeing issues with models that are too complex for technology to solve them. So if anything, we need to go back the other way. And I think it's all about keeping it practical. And if that means literally writing in words what you want to see and what you want that door to do, that's much better than saying I want an LOD 100 door. It's much better to say I want a door, I need it to be visualized, I need it to be colored, and I need it in 3D, and I want a vision panel or whatever showing. That to me is what we're trying to achieve with the standard. And obviously level of information need it's not really there yet in terms of showing examples, but for me, that's what it's fundamentally trying to solve.
Yeah, it's a difficult situation that we're in, where we've got so much of parallel kind of work, where we've got the desire to use plain language and to use level of information need framework and concepts, but we've got a lot of industry that is hanging still on this LOD number scale, and that transition is dangerous. And as you said, Rob, if you just have LOD 100, what does that mean? I mean, even inside of the BIM forum specification, it says we don't recognize this. Yeah, there are different scales. The AIA says one, the BIM forum says another. And then even when there is something that says there is an LOD 100, there are almost zero examples inside of the BIM forum specification. So it's a really difficult thing. But what's interesting is that in the US, there is now a drive from NIBS. I'm part of the BIM committee there, and we are looking to implement ISO 19650 as a national standard, but there is a big use of the LOD concepts in the US as well. So it's a kind of an interesting situation. And yeah, watch this space.
Can I add something to that? Sorry, Clive.
Yeah.
Based on what you were saying, the LOIN was not designed necessarily to replace LOD and LOI. It was designed to add more value. Basically, what is the reason or the purpose of providing this levels of detail or whatever for the information? So for those companies who are actually using LOD and LOI in an effective and efficient way, they don't necessarily need to scrap it and throw it away. LOD and LOI can still be put inside or as part of the pieces of information that are required in LOIN. So if we go back to what LOIN required, it requires purpose, it requires the format, the summary of what it's used for, the discipline, and so on and so forth. So LOD and LOI can actually be injected or inserted as part of that information that is being provided for the LOIN categories. It doesn't have to be thrown away necessarily.
I personally disagree that LOI, there's completely no point in having LOI when you actually know what information you want to specify. I want a fire rating for a door. Why do I need to then put a number against that to say there's a number against it? Why not just say in plain language what we want? I think whilst, yes, I agree with Noah that you can do that and you can keep it. I think what we need to do in order to, if you go back to Paul's slide about numbers, if we want adoption to happen, we have to make this plain language. We have to bring it back to what we've always done as an industry. And we have to go back to looking at all that stuff that's good stuff. There's lots of good stuff in information management, as Paul pointed out in his presentation, and we have to make this more accessible. And, you know, as somebody pointed out in the chat, you know, LOD was created by BIM consultants. I somewhat agree. And I'm a BIM consultant, but I'm very anti it because I don't think it helps in trying to explain things to people. And the more we can put this in plain language, the more chance we've got of adopting it. And I'm not saying that LOD or LOI is wrong, but I'm saying that I think there are better ways of doing that.
Yeah, this is it's a hot topic, and it has been for a while. And I must admit, I cringed when the LOI scale came out from a definition perspective, because it's not lean. If you want one property, but it is in an LOI of somewhere in the middle, you're going to get the rest of them as a result of that. So you need to be specific, as Rob says, and defining exactly what you need is a very important part of that. I'll ask Akos and Louis, you guys have been curating a lot of the questions as well. Let's move off of the contentious level of information need, level of detail. But yeah, it's definitely much better to spell it out with a purpose and understand what the information delivery milestone is and exactly what the geometry, certainly if it's needed in 2D, 3D, etc. I think we'll all agree on that. Can I ask you to jump in, or maybe Paul, have you seen some of the questions in the list? Anything that's relevant to you? I think a lot of people have asked, how do I get certified?
Oh, that's the one I wanted to avoid. Okay, now I will answer that question. I think there's been a few. One of the themes is in terms of who needs training. So I can certainly speak to that one. And yeah, as I said in the presentation, we're starting to see much more variety now in terms of the roles that people have that are seeking education around the information management process. And I think that's, again, breaking it down, just looking at part 2 for the delivery phase, there are 40 activities within that process. Okay. And, not one person, that's why we use a sort of superhero. Not one person has got the capability, the capacity, or the authority to undertake all of those 40 activities. Okay. And if you start looking at 3/4 of them are before you even produce information. Okay. So that sort of suggests that only the final quarter relate to the actual collaborative production of information. So all the upstream activities, you've got things like requirements management, planning, obviously, commercial, legal, contracts, insurance. And if you look at the people involved in that's your, asset managers, commercial managers, business managers, design managers, construction managers, and information managers as well. Okay, but they're all responsible for those activities, and it's those individuals who need to understand what their role is. They don't need to be an expert in the entire process. They just need to understand how to undertake their role in the information management process effectively. Okay, and so obviously that you then need to translate that to your organization, because it depends on where your organization sits in that process as well. So if you're a client, you're looking at steps 1, 2 specifically, in terms of looking at those activities. If you're a lead, appointed party, or whatever it is, then you're again probably looking at the middle third. And if you're actually a supplier somewhere down the supply chain and generally involved in the production of information, you're only really looking at the activities at the latter stages. So it really depends on where your organization sits in the process and where you and your role in terms of your responsibility for the different activities. In terms of certification, so there's been a few bits on there. There's some questions around UCAS. I think I can only speak on behalf of Operam in terms of that we sort of held off as long as we could, really, in terms of trying to work with the likes of Centre for Digital Britain to try and come up with an agreed specification that ourselves and all the training providers could align to. It turned out that just got put in the too difficult box. And so, yeah, we are now in this position where there are several badges and they keep coming as well. So I do feel a little bit sorry for people trying to sort of get a certification. But there, as it stands at the moment, I know there's work ongoing around UCAS, but as it stands at the moment, there's no globally agreed specification against which you can be certified for.
Definitely, there's a need for some kind of like I've done this and I'm able to help you better on your project, but it's the Wild West. And quite comically, if I move to our next standard, there's some more badges. so we next year are actually launching badges. Come and get your badges. But it's more about the software. So it's like, how do you use Planoly to make it simple right the way throughout that workflow? So if you're interested, I'm sure that they'll put the link in the chat so that you can go through that as well. And I think that Akos and Louis have got a bunch of other links to some resources. Somebody's asked, actually, Michael has asked for a list of all of the different education institutions. There are some more links. And we'll share those as well, because the CDBB did a great summary of some of the existing training material as well for ISO 19650. I think there were 16 or 18 different of the long list of training for BIM related topics that are also ISO 19650 related as well. So that will be thrown in the chat. There are a lot of questions around. So one of them, there are 6 volumes of ISO 19650. Does everyone need to read them? I think we sort of partially answered that, but has anybody got a response to that as far as how much should each team care about which piece? Obviously, there are things focused on security, things focused on operations.
Yeah, I think everybody should read all 6 at least 3 times. Well, yeah, just my personal point of view is no, they're not designed for everybody to read. They're only designed for people who have that responsibility for conformance or trying to develop business processes in alignment with ISO 19650. So yeah, and so if that is your role, then the answer will be yes. And I would say you probably need to familiarize yourself with the entire series. But if that isn't your role, then no, you shouldn't. There shouldn't really be a need for you to dive in too deep.
I mean, I would just add to that. I mean, I would say reading part 1, which is kind of the overview almost, is a helpful starting point. And then if you're delivering projects, design, construction, reading part 2 is probably the one you need to pick. And if you're on the asset side, picking part 3 is a logical place. I think most people probably don't need to go and read part 5 security, as Paul said, unless you're really implementing security stuff. I've read it and understood it, but I'm no expert in security, and I wouldn't necessarily be applying that. I'd be looking to some expertise in that. I understand when I need to apply it. You know, I think the UK BIM framework guidance is also helpful to read alongside that, because it does give you a bit more context. But it's no different to applying, say, ISO 9001. We apply ISO 9000. I got our ISO 9001 certification a number of years ago. Most of our staff have never read it and don't need to read it. It's documented in the processes in the business that ultimately satisfy that standard. And you know, the ISO is no different. I would say though that, you know, understanding part 2, if you're applying design and construction process, is useful to understand the 8 stages and broadly what it means, because, you know, it's helpful to understand that. And, you know, we try and at least, say educate is probably the wrong word, but we try and explain to people on projects, you know, what that kind of means. And just to touch back on the certification stuff, I think, you know, you guys are all doing great things. You know, Paul's platform is fantastic. I've, you know, used it in the past, and you know, you guys at Planoly are doing stuff as well. But for me, you know, if you're a client and you want to know, can somebody do ISO 19650, I would much rather somebody showed me case studies and examples of managing information than I would of finding a nice certificate that says it. And I actually had a contractor submit a certificate and said, we submitted our certificate of compliant certification, we don't need to submit anything else. And I was like, yeah, but who's the people on the project? Who's actually going to be delivering this? Who's going to be managing the information? They scored very badly for that. So for me, certification is useful. I think it helps people improve their processes in the same way 9001 and other standards do. But ultimately, it comes down to the proof in the pudding and your ability to deliver on projects in the same way that you do whether you're an architect or a contractor, and you need that case study material. I think it's a lot, for me, that's ultimately much stronger than having a certificate that says you've ticked a few boxes here and there.
I think that's a great point. I think if we could make that the request, obviously it's nice to have the certificate, but having that as the backup, obviously, yeah, backing up with some real case study material and the stuff that you share as well, Rob, not just a pretty slide with an image of the project rendered on it. It's actually some substance. Noha, can I ask? You've got. Oh, go on. Sorry, Paul.
I was just to add to that again from Rob in terms of the certification. So yeah, there is that sort of idea about, well, here's my certificate, I don't need to submit anything else. That came from another PAS standard. That was running for pre-qualification. So that shouldn't be running through into the tender stage. And I think 19650 is actually quite clear in terms of the BIM execution plan and the requirements of the BIM execution plan. Is that you're to present a resume, I think is the word we ended up with, for the key members who are going to be working on that team. So that is a key criteria within the BIM execution plan. And then you then confirm that those people that you put forward and are being evaluated are actually going to be working on the project. So yeah, so even, you know, just saying, you know, so and so has got this badge isn't enough. It needs to be demonstrate capability and capacity to undertake that role. Yep.
And it's not like, I remember when I was a contractor, we'd have bids and we'd send the same 5 CVs back and you'd never get that project team. So that's kind of a part where you might have a company that has this badge or a person that has this badge, but if you don't get both of those on your project with the case studies to back it up, then you're probably not gonna have a good experience. Noah, I was going to ask you about the standards. Do you have them available directly for your students, or do they have to? Do you're training them through using other material, or do they have access directly to the standards?
For our students, we have more than 50 standards that we have purchased for them. And they're not just in the area of information management or BIM or the ISOs, but we have them in other areas that are related to the construction industry as well, and even in other industries that might be useful from facilities management, supply chain management, project management, construction management, and many different areas that could complement their learning process.
Cool. I think that people are going to jump to another meeting very soon. So maybe 1 or 2 words or a sentence to just say, what should people focus on? So somebody said, there's a lot to cover. If I had to choose 2 or 3 things to focus on, what would they be? How do I start a pilot? Let me point. Rob, can you go first? What would be the one thing that they should focus on?
So where we started internally, I suppose, was focusing on task information delivery plans, and focusing on, from a delivery perspective, focusing on listing out what you would deliver on a project based on a structured template, if you like. And it starts to get you into that thinking about listing information in a consistent way. We've actually used it as a planning tool internally to think about standardizing our deliverables, as in architectural terms. So I think for me, in delivery terms, that's probably the obvious place to start. Now, I also know that the standards say you should start at the OIR, then you should work through PIR, AIR, and into an EIR. What I found in real projects is that what we find is that most clients actually are more engaged in the detail, because you can talk to people in detail, and you actually almost work back the other way. I know the standard says work left to right of starting at organizational level, but in reality you get people from different backgrounds, and a lot of them in client organizations are very focused on their particular areas, whether that's sustainability, health and safety. So I think I've learned that we shouldn't necessarily be so hung up on the standards when we start with the place that we feel comfortable with, rather than getting too hung up on saying, well, the processes, I've got to go through it in this order, and then you can build as much as you can, and as we did, fill holes as you go along and say, how do we improve this process? So it depends who you are, and as I said, I think delivery side, it's the TIDP, and I think on the client side, it's probably focusing on what information you're asking for across projects.
Noha, do you want to share where should people start? Come and get some of your students.
I think a very useful exercise would always be to start with doing a gap analysis without identifying what has been going well and what's missing and what's going wrong, maybe from legacy data, and maybe by doing assessment of the current resources, which could be human, it could be information, it could be software and hardware, it could be connections, it could be a lot of things. But without doing that proper gap analysis, it's very hard to improve or implement the right steps forward if that is not done well. And the gap analysis could be done quantitatively and qualitatively as well. So having these metrics and KPIs to do this assessment, I think, is very important.
Fantastic. Fantastic. And I think just Paul, have a final word. I realize that we've still got so many questions we didn't answer, but yeah, where should people focus? And we'll get back to people afterwards as well.
Yeah, so for me, obviously it depends on the activities that your team is going to be responsible for. Okay, I'm sort of agree with Rob in the sense of just focusing on them. Don't necessarily agree about the order, because a lot of the activities are interdependent, so rely on outputs from the previous activities. But wherever your starting point, for me, it's about the people and the team. So if you're working on a project, trying to get this off the ground, first thing I would do is get the team in a room, or at least the key people from the team. Explain to them these are the activities that we're responsible for, and then start just to work out collectively what do we have the capability to do. Do you know what I mean? And where not do we need any assistance? But have that chat first. Don't go off on your own trying to be that superhero. You need to bring people with you. So get everyone in a room, get them talking about it.
Cool. Thank you very much. Just a couple of adverts. We'll see you on the 4th of December for the next one in the series. And we also next year are starting a tips and tricks for Plannerly. Please come and join us for that. Really, it's been a pleasure to have you guys here, and some great debate on some really important topics. And it's a developing thing. We're all learning. Everyone's implementing and trying to be better. So let's do it together, because together we can do a lot more than we can if we're all implementing something different. And that's what I think ISO 19650 can do. Everyone getting behind the same standard, the same workflow. Thank you very much. Appreciate it, everyone.
Thanks, Clive.
Thanks, Clive.
Bye for now, guys.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.